Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the University of Chicago Institute of Politics Speaker Series event, Better Elections, Better Politics. My name is Ella Storms. I'm a first year at the college, and I am from San Diego, California. I'm a prospective law, letters, and society major, and my involvement at the IOP includes W+ Institute planning and cohort sessions, and U-Shy votes. I'm excited to introduce you all to tonight's panelists, who will be examining the history of tried, successful, and failed election laws and reforms, and what can be done to improve how we vote. Tonight's panel includes Ben Ginsberg, John Arnold, and Susan Kennedy. Ben Ginsberg served as counsel to the Republican National Committee, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and the National Republican Congressional Committee for 8 years before joining the international law firm Squire Patton Boggs. He also served as a national counsel to the Bush-Cheney presidential campaigns of 2000 and 2004, and to Mitt Romney's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. Ginsberg testified at the second public January 6 House Committee hearing regarding Donald Trump's 2020 election lawsuits. John Arnold is a former Enron executive and formed the hedge fund Centaurus Advisors. Currently focusing on philanthropy, John Arnold and his wife founded the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, which is now known as Arnold Ventures. Arnold and his wife have highly involved themselves in and gifted tens of millions of dollars to organizations including the Knowledge is Power program, the National Head Start Association, and the Innocence Project. Additionally, John Arnold is a vital supporter of drug price reform and funds the nonprofit Institute for Clinical and Economical Review. Susan Kennedy served as Cabinet Secretary and Deputy Chief of Staff to former Governor Gray Davis of California, and as the Communications Director for U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California. She also served on California's Public Utilities Commission from 2003 to 2006. In 2005, Kennedy became Chief of Staff to the then California Governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. She is currently the CEO and a board member of Green Biz, which aims to advance the transition to a clean economy. Moderating this event is the UChicago IOP's very own director, Heidi Heitkamp, who is a former U.S. Senator from North Dakota. As a reminder, please silence or turn off your cell phones. When it is time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience. Please line up and remember that priority for the first questions goes to students. Please visit the IOP's website for more information on future speaker series events and other IOP opportunities, including the Meet the Winter through Spring 2024 Pritzker Fellows at 5:30 p.m. on January 23rd, and Endless Wars, Weapons, and Force. But is there another purpose for the American military? At 12:30 p.m. on January 26th. Finally, I would like to invite you all to give a warm welcome to Ben Ginsberg, John Arnold, Susan Kennedy, and Heidi Heitkamp. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out. This is a topic that I think is so critical and so important, and I'm so grateful to my panelists for coming to the IOP, because we so often get discouraged students who come and say there's no hope. There's no hope for government, there's no hope for our elections, what can we do? And I think that sometimes there isn't an awareness that things are happening, that people are thinking about this, that there's investments being made in election integrity, there's been investments being made in election reform that can really change outcomes. And so I just want to, number one, thank you all for your work, but also thank you for coming to enlighten our students on what that work means and how maybe they could get involved. Don't forget, these are all really smart kids, so, poach them all you want. I want to start by kind of setting the stage. Pew Research Center does a lot of analytic work on voting and voting patterns, and they've been tracking for a long time something called public trust in government. The benchmark is really with Eisenhower going to where we are today in terms of how much people trust government. So let's just look at it. Eisenhower coming off World War II, coming off a major victory, fairly good economy. The Americans, pretty much 80% said, we trust our government. We believe our government is headed in the right direction. The last time they checked, when they asked if Americans trust government in Washington to do what's right, just about always it was 1%. Most of the time it was 15%. And so that creates a crisis, I think, in confidence. It creates a situation that has probably led to some of the other numbers I'm going to give you. So if you look at the 18, 20, and 22 elections, combined, about 70% of eligible voters voted in those elections. That's the good news. The bad news is that the number of Americans voting in all three is only about 37%. So if you look at that and then compare those general election ballot numbers to a primary, only about 21.3% of eligible primary voters go and vote to elect the nominees for these important jobs. So not a really good number in terms of participation. It doesn't give me a lot of optimism that people have confidence or are building confidence, although we saw rates of participation actually increase, but maybe motivated not by an enthusiasm, but a fear. And so now we're coming into 2024. And where is the voting population right now? I'm telling you that probably well over 60% of all the people in this country believe they won't have a choice, a meaningful choice for President of the United States. And I know that all of you hear this, that people say we have 330 plus million people in this country. These are the two choices we have. How did that happen? And so when we think about kind of where we are right now in our kind of political season, there is no time like now to explore how we can change these numbers, not in this cycle, but 10 years from now. And that's why we have this amazing panel. And so I want to start out by giving my panelists an opportunity to add to my tale of woe here. And we're going to start with Susan. Susan, anything you want to add to this that motivated you or motivates you to continue to work for election reform?
I actually was involved in one of the big reforms in California, and that was after there had been decades of attempts at political reform. It had failed over and over and over again, and the party leaders basically said, "Don't even bother trying. We beat you the last 6 times, and we'll beat you again." And we managed to pass. You got the right tools in the right place, and we managed to pass the most meaningful election reform in California history. And if I do nothing else in my entire political career, that is the one thing I will be the most proud of.
But what motivated you, Susan?
The gridlock was palpable. The gridlock, I spent 25 years working in the Democratic Party, and there was so much gridlock that by the time I left, I didn't want anything to do with politics. I was done. And when Schwarzenegger brought me back up to Sacramento as his chief of staff, this was a guy who believed anything was possible if you put your mind to it, which was mind-blowing just to be with a politician who believed that. And he put all of his muscle behind doing things that had never been done before, and he made me believe that it could happen. I mean, to work in politics for so many generations, and most politicians start sentences with, "Well, you can't do that because." There are rules, there are political rules, there are party rules, there's just rules about running for the next election. You can't do that because. He started every conversation with, anything is possible, and he believed it. And to inspire us as staff who'd been in this for a long time to think, wow, we really could do something that has never, ever succeeded before. And we did it. We did it over and over and over again. And it has lasting impact on people's lives. I still have politicians who come up to me today, this is 20 years later, they come up to me today and say, I would not have been elected to office if you had not passed that reform. And these are people who are now moving up into leadership positions, and they've moved the needle in terms of dialogue and being able to get things done.
I don't want to interrupt though, but for the uninitiated in the work that you did, what is the reform? Just describe the reform.
So we went from a closed primary system and gerrymandered districts to a top 2 primary. Where the top 2 you can vote for any candidate, and the top 2, regardless of party, make it into the runoff. And it had failed that any kind of open primary. 6 attempts, we either defeated at the ballot or found unconstitutional, but they were defeated 6 times before we got the top 2 primary on the ballot.
Thanks, Ben. So what motivates you to continue to fight the good fight here.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to be on this panel with John and Susan, and thank you all for coming. So, I'm sort of motivated by how polarized we are as a country and how that's changed over the years in which I've been involved. And that polarization, I think, is really part of the reason that you can't get these reforms through, that finding common ground has become much more difficult. And if I could use a panelist's indulgence, when we talk about these things, I always find it's useful to know a little bit more about all of you and for you to know about each other. So if you'd indulge me in a brief show of hands on things. How many of you are from Illinois? And how many of you grew up or live in the Central Time Zone? Eastern Time Zone, where you grew up? Mountain? Pacific? A foreign land, except for me and Susan, pretty much.
Out of California.
And how many of you voted, as long as you're old enough, and only once, in either 2022 or 2020? How many of you were too young to vote in those years? Okay. How many of you live in a state with a Democratic governor? And Republican governor? Good to have a Texan here, too. How many in a state with 2 Democratic senators and 2 Republican senators? Anybody from a split, one of the few states? Which states are you from?
Ohio, West Virginia.
There are only 8 senators who serve with somebody from an opposite party, which gives you some idea of where this goes. And how many self-identify as progressive liberal? How many conservative? Jesus, is anybody out there?
They're all moderates.
How about moderates? How many don't identify? And how many of you will consider voting for a third party in 2024? So, I kind of want to make the point that when we talk about the solutions, the United States as a country does not look like this. That in fact, we're a pretty divided country right now. Donald Trump is leading in the 2024 polls. MAGA world is not apparently represented in this room. So when we deal with the solutions to the problems we're going to be talking about, what I think and what does motivate me is trying to get the people who I represented for many years as a Republican lawyer in the same room as those who are represented in this room to actually trying to find practical solutions to the problems of the country, as opposed to sort of what we have is 2 groups that think they're fighting on principles who aren't talking to each other.
Okay. John? How did you get involved? I mean, you could have done anything, right? I mean, you're blessed because you're a smart guy who made a lot of money, using your talents, and you could apply those talents anywhere. And you're one of the few philanthropists, major philanthropists in this country that has stepped into this space. So what motivated you to do that, and how's it going?
First, I want to say thank you. I'm such a big fan of yours that it brought a Texan up to Chicago in January, which is not easy. But my wife and I run a philanthropic organization. It's a public policy group, and we work on systems, especially systems that have this interaction between government and people. So think about the healthcare system, criminal justice system, public finance, the energy system, et cetera. And as part of that, we're very interested in the policy aspect. So we don't do much on the programmatic side. We think that policy is much more structural, sustainable, scalable. And so that pulled us into the politics. If you're going to work on policy, you're working in politics. And we kind of quickly got frustrated that we would have these solutions that had bipartisan appeal and bipartisan sponsorship that would just hit a wall. and started thinking about why is there this dysfunction in DC. Now, you don't have to spend your life in public policy to have that understanding that DC doesn't work very well. That seems to be kind of a national sport for this country to complain about DC. But we started thinking about this in the same way of, this is a system, this is a electoral system, a political system. And so what are the rules and incentives that drive the behavior? And one can think of any number of components that are driving the dysfunction and polarization that we're seeing in DC, whether it's the echo chamber created by social media, whether there's the partisan cable news networks, whether it's the money in politics, whatever. But one of the aspects was the electoral system. How do we choose the people who represent us? And is that a proper representation of the people? And I think when we started looking into it, it became very clear that it was not, that a lot of people identify in the middle, somewhere between, depending on how you ask the question, a third to a half of people consider themselves moderate/independents. And yet, the people that we send to either state legislatures or to the Congress are much more at the tails, right, on either side. And so that kind of creates this divide of kind of this versus this, rather than representing the people in the middle. And so we started thinking about, okay, like if we believe the electoral system is part of that, and we think we can do something about that. I don't know how to change the incentives of social media. I don't know how to change cable news, but there was at least a pathway that was shown by Susan and Governor Schwarzenegger in California, as well as some other states, about what you could do. And so there's the Citizens Initiative, ballot initiative, that exists in about half the states. And you could use that to try to go around the politicians and to create real reforms. And so we settled on three. One was independent redistricting, so to get away from the gerrymandering. Second was nonpartisan primaries, so the belief that every voter should be able to vote for any candidate in every election. And the third was ranked choice voting. So when you get to the general election, that you have multiple candidates and you can express your full views of how you rank these candidates. And so we've been kind of deeply involved in all three of those for the past 10 years.
It's an amazing story, and I talk to students almost daily who are very discouraged and they're looking for solutions. And I'm saying there's some amazing people out there doing some incredible things to try and change the outcome, but it's really slow work. I mean, Susan just already told you how long it took. So, John, talk about how difficult this has been and how you have calibrated your expectations. This is a guy who really likes good ideas, and it's really hard when that good idea can't find its way into fruition or reality soon enough. And so it takes a lot of patience, the work you're doing. Yeah. Explain the work that you have, where you've had your successes and where you've struggled to move these issues ahead.
Yeah, I come from the financial trading world, which has the almost immediate feedback loop, and go to the public policy space, which has the maybe most delayed feedback loop. So it's definitely been a life shift. But I think that it certainly requires patience. And you're fighting several things. I think one is there's a status quo bias from the voters. And especially when you put something on the ballot, the natural reaction for voters is to be skeptical and to say no. And there really has to be like this strong, overwhelming sense of that the system is broken for a voter to consider voting for something that an opponent can deem as radical. And this is probably why it took so long in California to get your reforms passed. But you're fighting that. You're fighting that the politicians got elected in the current system. And so they have very little interest generally in supporting a new system. They don't know what the new system is. And so they're generally going to fight you. And third, I think we're kind of fighting the establishment. This takes power away from the political parties who are now kind of more extreme than the the average Democratic voter or the average Republican voter. Because of this kind of feedback loop and you close primaries, that the more extreme partisan is more likely to be vocal politically, is more likely to give money, is more likely to show up and vote. It's pulled both parties to the extreme. So when you're talking about reforms that can moderate, you start getting opposition from the political parties. And so you kind of have to find, that perfect scenario where the voters are just really fed up. You generally have to find a state that has the ballot initiative that can be initiated by citizens. Although there's one exception to date on that, Oregon, which you can talk about. And you have to get lucky. You have to have a strong local presence and strong kind of organizing committee, because they're going to be the voice of it. It's not going to be people showing up from Texas or showing up from a different state. It has to be a locally led effort. It can be supported by national supporters. It can be supported by national funders, but it has to be led locally.
Yeah, I can't stress that enough. As somebody who's done a number of ballot initiatives, how important it is to have that local impact and hopefully a contagion of the work. I just want to stress, when you think about the reforms in Nevada, the Democratic Party's fighting the reform because they're the majority party in Nevada. And in Alaska, now, given that they had an outcome they didn't like, it's the Republican Party that is now trying to overturn their ranked choice, Final Four ranked choice voting reform. So, Ben, I'm going to turn to you. When you look at the appetite within the Republican Party for reform, I mean, who are your go-tos? Who do you think will come out of this? You obviously work for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's expressed great concern, including in his recent book, the biography, about the future of our democracy if we continue to be as polarized and as non-fact driven. So who's the go-tos in the Republican Party now who are saying, we've got to fix this?
I'm not sure that those people exist, maybe in either party right now, just because of how polarized we are. And so I think that's a real difficult question to answer. The cure, it may not be a cure in the eyes of the Republican Party, but what you need is an election that demonstrates that the ideas that are sort of currently in favor, the Republican Party, don't work. I mean, the Republican Party lost 2018, 2020, 2022, yet the embrace of certain ideas like election denialism that I think are really harmful are not going to get washed away except electorally. It's not going to be a 14th Amendment solution. None of that's going to work. And in taking that into account, one of the things, and I think John's absolutely right about how polarized the party caucuses have become. But I think to address the problems, you also have to recognize the demographic changes that have come about in the country. There's been a 50-year big sort. 50 years ago, people lived in much more much more mixed communities. And over the last 50 years, we are much more living with people like ourselves. The result of that is that the interaction to come into the middle is much harder on a daily basis, much less frequent on a daily basis, so that you do get polarized states. On top of that, many of the reforms that we're going to talk about tonight appear for all the world to Republicans to be democratic solutions because they can't win enough elections in the majority of the country, so let's change the rules to try and get at it. And so I think that perception among Republicans is really important. So I'm not sure who the members of the current Republican Party are who are going to embrace any of the things we're likely to talk about, with some exceptions in localized places. Republicans in California would love to be able to do something about redistricting, for example.
Yeah. Susan, so you obviously led this initiative, but as you were thinking about what what would really be meaningful. And I think if I'm playing devil's advocate, I would say, you know, how many times in your situation have two Democrats ended up, you know, basically serving? And I think there's a lot of talk today that two Democrats will come out of that Senate race and not have a Republican on the ballot. So what do you say to me if I'm a Republican saying, you know what, it's so overwhelming statewide. I'm from a Republican county in Central California. I don't even get a choice because you've set up a system now that only gives me two liberals.
I would say, first of all, it's not about you. It's about it's about the voters. And what the Republicans in California care about now is trying to retake back some ability to get, you know, to change the rules so that they can get elected, because they've reduced in relevance to a point where they literally have no presence in Sacramento or in other areas. But I want to answer your question by responding to two things I heard here. First of all, the solution is not going to come from within the parties. It's just not. Right, has to come from outside the parties. When Arnold Schwarzenegger did the election reforms in California, there were Republicans and Democrats literally cursing us on the floor of the legislature because they hated it. They would never vote for it unless they had to. And the second thing was what you said about you have to have some luck. You need to be prepared. But this is an opportunity. This is something that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Voters they get pissed off with gridlock, right? And you have to, if we put that measure on the ballot at the wrong time, if we brought it up at the wrong time, it would have failed again because our timing would have been off. It's not about the politicians, it's not about the parties, it's about the mood of the voters and giving them the ability to make a change. It was almost an accident that we got the redistricting done in California, the top two primary. It wasn't something we planned from the first day we were in office. It was a group of people, including Democratic legislators, who had drafted a measure long before we brought it for a vote, and they bulletproofed it on a constitutional basis because everything had failed before on constitutional basis. And so it was fully baked and ready to go. So we knew that it would pass constitutional muster. But then it was after 3 years of the financial crisis, it was during the Great Recession, people were so tired of just like trying to get out of the budget deficit that we were in, this horrible lockjaw. But the governor couldn't run for another office. He didn't care about running. He couldn't run for president. He wasn't running for anything else. So he was ready to leave it all on the field. And we held out. We had the control over getting 2 Republican votes to pass the budget in the Senate, and we cut a deal with the Republican the legislator there and said, you don't vote for the budget until we get this reform. And it was like we stayed there. They were going to shut down the entire government, but Arnold Schwarzenegger knew that this was the moment to get something big done, and he made it a point to do it. It was just timing.
They obviously hadn't watched The Terminator. Didn't know that this is a guy who's got serious resolve, right?
Yeah, well, there were some stories there, but yeah.
John.
Yeah, if I can just pop in, the irony is that Republicans are kind of most against these reforms today. I think part of that is timing in that the electoral reforms coincided with a lot of efforts to kind of change how people voted, right? The vote by mail, the automatic registration, those types of reforms, or kind of same-day registration, that very much had a partisan tint to it. And so I think people think about electoral reforms, oh, that's a Democrat thing. And the partisan aspect was on trying to expand the voter base. And I can say, is that actually partisan or not? But that's how kind of people in the politics industry view it. Whereas the proposed changes on open primaries, on nonpartisan primaries, on ranked choice voting are very much, they lack any bias towards either party. And I think the Republicans are arguably today like the most to benefit from some of these reforms. If you look back at the Senate race in 2022, when 6 months in advance, kind of all the experts viewed that Republicans had a very high probability of retaking the Senate. And the candidates that Republicans chose through their primary process ended up being those that had very little appeal by the true swing voter. And so it was kind of this perfect storm that Republicans nominated a bunch of candidates that couldn't win in the general. And had there been a top four with ranked choice voting, I think Republicans would control the Senate today.
Well, I think let's all talk about power and control, because no one likes to share power once they have power, which is the point here, that we are now talking about those kinds of things that really put voters in the driver's seat, that give us an opportunity to have better and more diverse choices, right? So the theory behind Final Four, Final Five voting is that there will be somebody who represents all of, the entire spectrum, potentially, of the body politic. But one of the things that I want to talk about, because I list this as one of the reasons to think about this reform. If you pair that with ranked choice voting behind, which some people call instant runoff. So you pair it with ranked choice voting, I'm not going to go and say mean things about an opponent that I think their supporters could potentially rank me second. And so the idea is that you could also lower the temperature of these very contentious races. And if you believe, as I do, that a lot of the reason why people don't like government is because everybody in government tells them not to. I mean, depending upon which side of this you're on. So have you seen, John, in particular, because you've done most of the stuff on ranked choice voting, and have you seen a different kind of campaign from that in the states that have adopted your reforms?
Yeah, so Maine adopted it in 2020 and then Alaska in 2022. So on the top four plus ranked choice voting, it's still very new. And New York City's done one election with it. So we don't have, the political scientists kind of argue the theory. We don't have good empirical data on this, but there's kind of very strong consensus from the political science theorists that this should lower the rancor of campaigns. But what kind of convinced me was hearing the anecdotes that came out of California, and maybe Susan, you can talk about this, about how kind of the trio of reforms that was passed in California, how that changed politics there.
Yeah, and I think, the problem we were trying to solve with the California top two primary was to draw the candidates closer to the center so that they were more responsive to the voters, right? And there was a debate about whether or not it should be the top three, or why just the top two. And there's actually a lot of data behind the fact that the top two was the right solution at the right time for us, because it forced but all the candidates were vulnerable to being beaten if they went too far to the left or too far to the right, whatever, right? If you put a third candidate up there, they act as a spoiler, and it would by creating that spoiler, it would have pushed the others more extreme. It would have undone the effect of having the top two, because in the top two, it basically gave the voters the leverage in terms of the outcome of the general election. And so it just changed the dynamics if you added a third. So
Ben, I want to mention that, when you look at demographics, and we don't know yet what this next election will bring, but I would argue that, and as I think McCarthy said, Speaker McCarthy on the way out, he said, we're not a party that looks like America anymore. You have struggles within the Republican Party to get the youth vote. You have struggles to have a sizable portion of minority voters. Women now are abandoning the Republican Party over some policy issues, obviously, been a major challenge. So how do you see an election reform that would bring more diversity to the Republican Party?
Well, I think you're framing that in the way a Democrat would frame the issue. And so
Well, do you think you have a lot of I didn't say this. Speaker McCarthy said this on the way out the door.
Yeah, but I think you could also actually make that argument about the Democratic Party today. That, in fact, the Democratic Party can't win races in the South, can't win races in the Mountain West. Doesn't look like America today. It does look like certain parts, but not other parts. And I think both parties are that way. That goes to the whole polarization I was talking about. Look, what is true, I think, about all these reforms is that I don't know of one of them that has been put forward that would actually hurt the people who you want to see get elected to office.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the point I was trying to make before about the polarization and the split in America. And I also think that framing the issue now about either of the parties is probably not the right way to look at the issue, because the parties today are mere shadows of even their former selves and certainly what they could be. They're not viable governing forces today. So part of what I think you should look at in terms of reform is the way you can actually strengthen political parties, just because as a matter of governmental design, having centralized, cohesive governing entities who compete on the basis of ideas instead of the crazy stuff we're competing on now would actually be a reform that might work. But of course, that cuts into the way we've been doing campaign finance since the 1970s, a way that has demonstrably failed and failed the country. So I'm not sure that that's the right frame to start.
If I could just take a minute, the primary that we just started, primary, it's kind of like a primary, although they call it a caucus, 64% of the people who showed up were over the age of 55 in Iowa. And so I think, my point was, if the primary system were more open, don't you think more young Republicans who maybe have a different perspective on some of the social issues would feel more empowered to get into the race and actually drive a different kind of demographic?
Maybe, but if you look at the polling today, one of the real worries one reads about Joe Biden's reelection is that he's losing the youth vote, that it's not coming out to vote. So the question, I think, is more how you get all youth going than just Republicans. And I'm not sure I would draw too many conclusions from Iowa, which really is a special place unto itself and pretty idiosyncratic.
Be careful.
I say that as somebody who spent many memorable cold wintry days going across the state, but it's not. It is not typical of.
Yeah, but this was a very low turnout, very.
And there were warning signs. I mean, actually, the warning sign to the Republican Party should be that in Polk County, which is Des Moines, turnout was extraordinarily low, so that Nikki Haley didn't get a bounce out of it. Nobody got a bounce out of it. It was an indication or a suggestion that suburban, especially women, have abandoned the Republican Party.
I just think it's an example of where the process did not enfranchise a lot of voters, a lot of people to, and what we're really trying to talk about. I have a friend, Michael Steele, who is former chair of the Republican Party, is a dear friend, and we occasionally joke because, we say, we want everyone to vote. He says, no, the political parties do not want everybody to vote. They want their voters to vote. They don't want everybody to vote. And I think in a healthy democracy, I want to also get to reforms that we haven't talked about that maybe you've rejected, but in healthy democracy, we should want everyone to vote.
Before you leave that point, what he said, he and I don't see eye to eye exactly on this point, but his point was that strengthening the parties would somehow be a reform that, I'm not quite sure how to finish the sentence in terms of what you think that
would be a reform that would help sort of ameliorate the contentions, because the parties would be able to have more ability to mold their candidates.
I think that is diametrically opposite of what would actually happen. And so, you followed on with comment about the caucuses. I was the executive director of the Democratic Party in California. I ran the Get Out the Vote campaigns for, in 2 elections for all the Democrats and everything. And I can tell you from inside both the Democrats and the Republican parties, the party's job is to get their members elected. Their party is not their job to enfranchise the voters, to bring more voters out. They only want their voters to come out, and I've seen both, particularly inside the Democratic Party, their job as a governing entity is simply to keep their members in line. I mean, they specifically punish anyone who goes rogue on them. And you look at Kyrsten Sinema, look at Joe Manchin. We saw that in California. And if you are rogue enough to be a moderate voter in a state like California, you are the ones that the other party targets in the next election. That's where compromise means you have a target on your back, and the parties cannot defend you. They can't, and they won't defend you unless you've towed the party line on a policy basis.
Democrats and Republicans have different visions of the party for historical reasons, I think. Democrats, when you ran your Get Out the Vote operations, you had real buy-in from a number of affinity groups, labor, a number of other groups. Republicans never had that infrastructure in outside groups, and so Republicans did their party operations because they didn't have as many outside groups to run combined campaigns with. So the parties, I'll acknowledge that I approached this from the way that Republicans did, which was to really make up for not having as many affiliated outside groups as the Democrats did. So the ability of Republicans to sort of have a unified governing theory 20 years ago, 30 years ago, stemmed from the strength of the party. And the way things work now, candidates need 3 things to get elected, maybe more, but 3 things in a campaign sense. They need money, they need the ability to mobilize voters, and they need messaging. And when the political parties were stronger and how they could be made stronger, they would provide those necessary resources for candidates. Today, the political parties are not doing any of that in the loudest voice for any of their candidates. It's being given to special interest outside groups that do control the way different candidates perform and then how they act as legislators. And so that sort of, you've got an army of free rangers in the congressional caucuses, and it's really hard to get a coherent governing strategy.
If I can agree with both of you, I think I agree that the party's goal is to get their candidate elected in the general election. Right? And I think where that nominee is being selected in this partisan primary system, you often end up with a candidate that doesn't have broad appeal. And the smoke-filled room, although it had problems, was designed to get a candidate that had broader appeal. So I think it would lead to kind of a more moderate candidates being selected by the party establishment to run in the general. Now, it might have negatives once that person actually gets into office, that they have less independence and have to kind of toe the party line and are unable to be kind of to vote against the party.
So I mean, I think you see the complexity because you pull on one string and you're taking away power from someone who doesn't want to give it up, and all of this and all of this thing that we're talking about here is an attempt to enfranchise the people of this country to run government and to have a say and feel like I was in Iowa and I talked to a young woman who was the receptionist or the woman who seats you in a restaurant. And I said, I try and talk to everybody when I'm in Iowa. And she said, I have no interest in voting. It doesn't matter. And she was a young woman just recently out of college. That is a problem in this country, that she, number one, doesn't take it as a civic obligation to vote, but that she doesn't believe that there is any reason for her to do this. So how do we persuade her? What do we do in election reform because John, you aren't doing this to reform elections. You're doing this to get better policy by changing the way we elect our leaders. Mm-hmm. So we're assuming that this is going to lead to better policy. So how do we persuade someone like that woman, that she should vote and that reforms are on the way? How do we persuade her to vote?
I am dealing with a similar situation in my own family, and I bet a lot of us have this. I've got an older brother who I love dearly, and was a Planned Parenthood counselor in college, and he's turned into a MAGA Republican. We used to have the greatest debates on the planet, and I mean, it was an event every holiday because we would have these great debates. He has now become a guy who does not believe that his vote matters at all. And he's become the angry, willing to blow up the boxes. I mean, scary for someone that I've known for so many years. And so he's a work in progress. I'm working on him. I moved next door to him. I'm working on him. But it's like they've become so distrustful of the process and the outcome that it's you've got to give people a reason to believe that their vote matters, but that government matters. It's not about their vote as much as it matters. They think they don't matter. It doesn't matter who they vote for. Whatever it is they think that needs to happen in government, it's not happening. We're not communicating with them. Part of it may be something you said earlier. It's like every election cycle in American democracy is an exercise in bad-mouthing the other person, no matter whether or not they're good or not, or whether you disagree with them. We vilify the other party, the other person running in an election. And so every 2 years, candidates get up there and they promise voters that they're going to change, and then get elected to office, and nothing really changes from the voters' perspective. In the next 2 years, they're going to come back and tell you how bad things are again, and it's like there's something about the way that our election system works in terms of the way we communicate in elections, that it makes people believe they become hopeless because they're being told that things are horrible and nothing good is happening, when that's in fact not the case.
I think we have a system that's designed such that the vast majority of votes in November don't matter, right? So you have roughly 80% of Senate seats. The winner is predetermined. When you get to November, if the polls close at 8 o'clock, at 8:01, the AP is calling it. Right? So if you don't show up to vote in that Senate race, it doesn't change anything. In probably 85% of the country, your vote doesn't matter in the presidential election. Your state's going either red or blue, it doesn't matter, you're not in a swing state. And then the worst is in the House of Representatives, right? With the gerrymandering, that is over 90% of the districts are predetermined about who's going to win. And so how do you convince someone who's a marginal voter, should I go spend an hour of my life standing in line in November if my vote doesn't matter? We have a system designed such that vote doesn't matter for most people. And I think that's a hard argument about why you should still go out there.
Yeah. Ben?
Well, part of the problem with redistricting and gerrymandering is that self-sorting that I talked about, where it's really hard to draw competitive districts in many states. Now, there are some that are badly gerrymandered. If you had gerrymandered reform in a number of them, including your home state of Texas, it wouldn't make a difference. But the studies show that there may be 24 seats in the House of Representatives that could be unwound and made more competitive, but that's all. That's less than 10%, about 5% of the seats in Congress actually could be changed. The makeup could be changed with gerrymandering reform. But to your question about how do you provide hope, I think we need to take a step back and recognize something about the person who doesn't think voting matters, and your brother. We do a terrible job of basic, fundamental civic education for people in grade school, high school, college to understand how important this is. It's just been a failure of the educational system. The studies show that the lack of knowledge about the fundamentals of our government and the way the elections work is like shocking. And that goes to basic civic education in the schools. Now, to take that into another issue, I spend a lot of time these days working with election officials who, goodness knows, are the people under assault the most in the sort of distemperate world we have, and trying to help them both with substantive matters and sort of support groups and solutions to election denialism. It is not something that is going to be solved on a national level. It is really an appeal to local communities. And I think that's true for getting people more involved in politics. People, according to the polls, see much more of a connection with what happens in their neighborhoods and in their communities than they do with what those other people are doing in other states and certainly nationally. And the national environment for dealing with all this is really, really poisonous. But on the local level, there is much more of a recognition that peace and prosperity in your community is important to more people across the ideological spectrum. And so it's a combination of civic education to understand how important it is, and recognizing that you can impact things locally much easier than you can statewide or nationally.
Can I take that down one more?
I want to just invite. Do we have microphones set up, or are we going to just pass them around? Huh? They will be set up. Okay. So we're going to set up microphones, and I want you to start thinking about your questions because we're going to turn to questions. But Susan,
I want to take what he just said down one more. It starts by putting your own mask on first, right? It's like I remember in the 2000 election, and a lot of my Democratic friends afterwards, when George W. Bush was elected to office, they were caustic about George Bush, and they would call him by his last name. And I've been in, I don't know, I'm a student of history, whatever it is. I don't care how much you might disagree with somebody. I said, that's the President of the United States. I was the executive director of the Democratic Party. I couldn't listen to my own friends calling him by his last name because it degraded the office of the president. It's like every time you're in a conversation today and you say something very caustic about what's going on, you're creating that hopelessness for somebody else. I mean, it's like taking the temperature down starts with what I do today to make sure that we're having a civil conversation and that we all have the power to affect the people that we're talking to.
Yeah, I want to just one lightning round question, and then we'll start taking student questions. One reform that you would love, but you don't think is practical to get done. John.
Proportional voting?
You get a little bit more.
So you said lightning. Proportional voting is where if one party gets 25% of the vote, they get 25% of the seats.
Okay.
Rather than this kind of winner-take-all system we have today.
Okay.
Campaign finance reform.
Good answer.
Nonpartisan districts. No gerrymandering.
You're sticking with your reform, but you got it done. You just wish it was
nationwide.
Nationwide.
Sorry, I meant impose it on everybody else.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and take student questions. Start
Hello. My name is Oliver. I'm a first-year student in the college. I'm from Toledo, Ohio. No one else is. It's fine. My question is about sort of some quirks of the top two primary system that California has, including this last cycle in 2022, when one of the most Republican state Senate districts, which in California means over 1 million people, ended up with a top two that was 2 Democrats because 6 Republicans split the vote. Do you think that that's a necessary trade-off for the benefits of the open primary system, or that there should be some measures to control sort of the number of candidates fielded by either party?
I believe it's a necessary trade-off. If that district was, because we also had districting reform, right? So they're not gerrymandered district. And if that district ended up with top 2, and they're both Democrats, then the voters have spoken, right? And it's like, and it's a function of respecting what's going to happen in an open primary, not changing the process so you can guarantee a Republican gets in.
So if I can give a different perspective, I think I agree with you. Like if you have plurality voting, like to have 3 in the general, then it creates the problem of the spoiler. I think the benefit of a top 4 plus ranked choice voting is it solves this issue. It doesn't matter if there were 6 Republicans or 2 Republicans that ran. You end up almost certainly. You can kind of find some very random edge cases, but you have an election that then represents the will of the people. And if the will of the people wanted a Republican and it was just so happened that the 6 Republicans in the race split all that Republican vote and the 2 Democrats were the top 2 vote getters, I don't think that represents the will of the people. And that's what the ranked choice voting component of it. So kind of take the top 2, take it to top 4 plus ranked choice voting solves that.
Next.
Talk about that over dinner.
I'm Thomas, a 4th-year student. Imagine when you try to replace an old voting system like first past the post with a new voting system like ranked choice voting. The party that's winning under the old system will not like the change. They'll try to oppose it because it means at least a likely hit to their short-term electoral success. Are there ways to incentivize or compensate the winning party under the old system to accept the change?
Who wants that one?
No.
No.
That's a quick answer.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm a 3rd year in the college studying law, letters, and society. A question I have hearing this discussion is, I think it can sometimes feel very helpless. There's so many causes you can think of. And I wonder, do you think this is something endemic to American democracy, that it's just about, the Electoral College preserving the abilities of the elites? Or can we kind of trace this feeling of hopelessness in voters, that I don't have a choice or an impact to a certain moment in time, and that, maybe if we can trace it to a moment in time, there's something causal about it, or there's a reason that we've seen this recent increase in voter hopelessness?
Okay. I'll start. This may feel like it's like the most hopeless time in our history, but that's not the case. I mean, we've as a society, we've been through some pretty severe ups and downs, and Civil War is the most obvious one. But there have been, I don't think you can tie anything to a particular causation, but it's a cyclical thing, and it's based on a lot of factors. And I think the symptom you have to pay the most attention to is trust, right? Because you can feel hopeless, but about what's happening, or you can feel afraid about what's happening, but if you don't feel like you have any power to do anything about it, to protect yourself, that kind of fear creates irrational, crazy behavior. So I think it's really, we started this conversation around trust in government. That's the thing the symptom that I think I would pay most attention to.
Ben?
I very much agree with that analysis. We have been through other really tough times in our history and come through because the institutions held. This does feel like a perilous time because faith in institutions, whether political or religion or the educational system, and you can go on, is reduced right now, and that feels pretty tenuous. COVID didn't help. So there is a solution to that, actually, rather than feeling helpless, is to get involved yourself and actually do something. You can sit at home and watch cable TV and read whatever sources of information you're getting, and you sort of go down a rabbit hole. And actual going out and doing something meaningful in a community, and again, a local community, I think is where you can have the most impact and see the most results, is actually the antidote to that feeling of helplessness, I think.
John, you got a comment?
I don't have anything to add.
Great.
Thank you.
If I can just kind of reiterate what John started in his comments, which is, if you care about policy, and a lot of you care about a lot of issues, whether it's climate, whether it's public safety, the lesson here is that if you want a different outcome, you have to make sure that you have a real choice. that you have a real voice in hearing about those issues. And so we're not just here talking about politics for politics' sake. We're here talking about the importance of these reforms and maybe pursuing different policy outcomes that are maybe reflective of what the public believes they need. And so just want to make that point.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm a first year in the college, and there hasn't been any mention of any other countries with free elections, and I was curious if there's anything that's happened recently in other systems that has given a lot of hope for like free elections in the world that maybe could be brought here, some ideas or other systems and that have worked well.
Thank you. If I can just add to your question, one of the things that I didn't get to is how does our binary party system compared to a parliamentary system where there's a lot of parties, how does our system create the problems that we have?
I've actually had, I always go back to the problem that I sense we have in our democracy, which is every 2 years that we go out and we promise the voters we're going to do X, Y, and Z and change whatever, and then it doesn't really happen, and the voters just get pissed off and they think nothing ever really changes, right? And I sometimes wish that we had the ability that they have in the parliamentary systems where the government can fail, right? And it's like, and then you have, then the voters, then you actually have a responsive government body that has to, has to respond to a pissed off electorate. We don't have that here. I mean, you just stay pissed off until the next election. And I don't think it's something we could impose here. I don't think it's something we could do here. I think what we have and the tools we have in terms of the ones I am most enamored with, the open primary and the non-redistricting are the thing to do that is the most important. But I do kind of wish the government could fail and voters could have a say in the middle of an election cycle.
Any other comments? One of the things that I would mention is Australia, you're mandated to vote, and if you don't, you get fined. And so we haven't talked about mandated voting or absolute, requirement that people vote the same way. If you're going to drive a car, you're going to get a driver's license. So
they also have ranked choice voting there.
So there are other things that are going on in other countries that would suggest that these are reforms that they've adopted to further enfranchise voters, connect people. Interesting. Next.
Hi, my name is Carter, and I'm a first year in the college, and I'm from West Virginia. And recently, our Secretary of State published an op-ed advocating that ranked choice voting be banned in the state, largely because he believes it'd be too confusing for voters. So how do we increase voter education about not necessarily new, but new systems of voting to the U.S. and to certain states? And how do we make it so that people aren't afraid of future reform simply because they may not understand the process?
Yeah, so I think the opponents of ranked choice voting will throw these scare tactics out. Right? We have the benefit now of having 2 states and many cities who have adopted it. And so you can see what's happened. Right? And kind of overwhelmingly, it's been a positive reaction to the extent when there was a lot of pressure on Republican lawmakers in Alaska to try to repeal it. Through the legislative process, there was enough positive feedback that they were hearing from the voters that they kept it. And so what we've seen is there was, scare tactics thrown out that it was going to reduce turnout. It did not. There were scare tactics that it was going to make it harder for the less educated voter to vote. It did not. Now these need to be combined with a voter education process, but I think the argument that someone can't figure out, rank your choices 1, 2, 3, I think is insulting to the voter, and it's contrary to what we see in reality. And so it is a very common refrain from people who are opposed to it, but it's an argument that's really lost its luster, in my opinion.
Not in West Virginia, apparently.
Well, Mac Warner is Secretary of State who wants to be the governor. And I think it is an example of the fact that these reforms feel like one-sided political reforms of Democrats trying to change things because they can't win elections, which is certainly the case in West Virginia. So unless you manage to convince people that this has got to be a bipartisan good, as opposed to one party trying to exert its will to bring the land of the deplorables back to civil society, it's not going to succeed as a political matter.
Agree.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sabri, and my question is about polls. As a political science and data science major, I've come across polls in two or three courses, and I've seen there's so many ways in which polls could go wrong. And as we're approaching elections, polls are just popping up everywhere now. And I've seen you mention polls in your conversation here today a couple of times. And so my question is, how do you verify that the polls that you're mentioning or the polls that you're using in your respective experiences are good polls, usable polls?
Well, in polls, there is a little bit of art and a little bit of science. And the art is pollsters ask people questions and then weight the polls to reflect what they think the electorate's going to be. So you need to recognize that there's a little magic in any poll. So you should look for the larger sample size polls as more reliable. The polls that actually tell you the demographic makeup of who they're polling is really important. Like a national poll that shows one candidate ahead of another is not really valuable for telling you who's ahead in the presidential race, because the presidential race is going to come down to 4 or 6 states and not a national sampling that probably overweights for the bigger ones. And I think the best way to deal with polls is to go to the aggregation sites, the one who have polls of polls, and look at them for a blending of them. And don't take the numbers themselves as indicative of anything, but look at the changes from one set of polls to another to look for trends as opposed to specificity.
And I completely agree on polls of candidates. I think, polls of issues are notoriously bad, right?
Yeah.
And they're so susceptible to how you phrase the question that you can get radically different responses. And so what we've found is that if, on areas in which we work, if we're sitting down with a Republican lawmaker, the first thing they're going to look at on a poll is who conducted it, right? And was it a Republican polling operation that conducted it, such that they have faith in the wording of the question so that they can have more faith in what the results of the poll were. And if it is, the lawmakers have learned this, and there are, from both sides, they will look at it and say, if so-and-so did it, I don't even want to look at it because I know I can't trust it.
Do you find focus groups where you sit down with a small number of voters across the spectrum more valuable than the polls? For
Yes,
dealing with issues?
absolutely.
I've using polling and focus groups to figure out how we want to talk about something or what the issues are. If any poll that we would ever make public, I wouldn't trust.
Okay, so just to reiterate, it is about trust, because we've seen that most of these polls are secretive about their methods, and I've kind of studied most of or the basics of the methods, and I've seen many polls that were very bad and had many faults in their methods. So when it comes to policymaking, as opposed to, I know we're approaching elections and all the polls are going to be looking at who's going to win. But when it comes to gauging public opinion, for example, do you rely on polls by trusting?
You had your one. There's other people behind you. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming out and talking. My name's Will. I'm a second year studying mathematics. I have a question for something John said. You said that you used to work in finance, and in finance you said there's instant feedback, whereas in policy it's like some of the most delayed feedback. As a student, that resonates with me because I know that if I'm submitting a PSAT and I don't have feedback in the next couple weeks, I'll be much less motivated. Yeah. Whereas if I'm getting instant feedback, it's more motivating to do good work. So my question for you is, how do you think we could make government have a tighter feedback loop, and how do you think that could be done?
Wow, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. I think the unintended consequences of any policy change can be very significant. And it's one of the reasons that we pride ourselves as an organization of being very evidence-based and evidence-driven. And what we like to see, I think the optimal way to conduct policy is try it out at a small scale. And this is the federalist system that we have in America allows states to do different things and to learn from those activities. And so we spend a lot of resources on evaluations of policies and trying to see okay, there was a theory of if you did X, then what the results would be. Very oftentimes those results aren't what they were actually, what the theorists thought they would be. And so understanding the unintended consequences of policy and understanding how, I think the senator mentioned this earlier, if you pull one string, what happens to the others can be very dramatic. And so, again, the optimal way for policy is take advantage of this federalist system and experiment at the states and see what's working, what's not, and then spread it at the state level. And hopefully there's enough of a robust evidence base that you can adopt it nationally.
And I want to encourage you all, if you're interested in the work that John does, to follow him on X. He's frequently slaying sacred cows. These solutions haven't worked for a lot of years. Why are we still doing them? Which I think is a fair way to evaluate some of the work that you do, John. And so I think you need those voices out there that are really nonpartisan, that are really evidence-based. And I think it's rare to have somebody who has focused all of their effort on that space, because a lot of times people work to just justify the decisions they've already made. We have time for one last question. Oh, just take it off there you go. Those tall guys.
Hi, my name is Mariana. I'm a first-year MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy. So my question is about political parties, and it's sort of a culmination of what was said by everyone. Essentially, if a political party's job is to get their candidate elected and their want is for their voters to vote and not necessarily all voters, how do you believe we can neutralize or change the landscape of political parties so that they are motivated to enfranchise all voters?
Good luck.
It should be take their choice away from the parties. I mean, it shouldn't be their. How do you motivate the parties to make all voters? You won't motivate the parties. You can set the laws and the rules and the campaign so that, if voting was mandatory, I don't know if that's not feasible, but you're not going to change the parties. So change the system. Focus on the voters.
Ben?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the expectation has to be that people act in their own self-interest, right, including the party. And so they're going to support things and find a logic and argument as to why they're supporting certain policies associated with voting and why they're against others. And it just so happens to coincide with the policies that support them. Right? And so I don't know how to drive people away from doing everything within those rules of the system to maximize their outcomes.
But people do coalesce around issues, especially locally, across party lines. The votes that have taken place on abortion referendums in deep red states is an example of that. So, the parties in their current form are sort of not terribly useful institutions. But if you really want to get involved and change things, then it is finding issues that can bridge the partisan gap.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank the three of you so much for this. This to me is such an important topic because it offers some hope where people haven't seen hope in the past. That, yes, my voice matters, my vote can matter, and we can do things that differently that will tell us that we can build back trust in our elections, trust in our institutions, and you guys have done a great job. Thank you so much, John, Ben, and Susan. Can you join with me? Thank you. A wonderful panel.